Economies get into crisis states time and again. How can such crises be prevented? Can they be predicted? That was the core of the question in an essay that I wrote in 2012. The jury for the Leibniz Prize, which the German Research Foundation awarded me in 2021, stated, "This research developed a more fundamental understanding of crisis dynamics that can help predict and mitigate future crises." I wish I could even begin to share this optimistic assessment. We still know very little about the dynamics and causes of economic crises. Crisis issues have stuck with me in my research, especially the questions of political reactions to and political responses to crisis. What do we know about successful crisis management? What works and why? How do we manage to get to the right decisions in crisis-dictated real time, to get to the knowledge to the decision makers quickly and equip them with the tools they need to make decisions? My own research was mainly about financial crises, which is really what I know best. Financial crises like the ones we had in the US not so long ago, a few months ago, when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. And a few days later, some of you will remember, the Credit Suisse also went belly up. In this crisis, central banks used the freedom offered by a flexible currency regime and provided liquidity to the banking sector. They followed a well-known playbook. And in the end, all investors got their money back. Among them were many tech companies with fully funded tech companies, and even an odd billionaire like Peter Thiel, who unsuspectedly had many millions in the accounts of Silicon Valley Bank. The storms passed, the stock market wobbled briefly, but things then came back to normal. Was the reaction correct? Was the crisis management successful? From a macroeconomic perspective, yes. The crisis was over, the collapse averted. But criticism was not long in coming. Should taxpayers' money really used to protect the assets of large investors? Where were the incentives for better behavior in the future? Where was liability and responsibility? Was this a case of crisis management that's successful in the short term but dangerous in the medium term? And misbehavior was programmed into the future. Do, as a result, central banks have to run faster in the end just to stand still? What, in other words, is optimal crisis management? But ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to go far. We don't have to venture into the Silicon Valley to talk about emergencies. We had an emergency here in Europe last year. It was very real. It was the Ernstfall. And there were major decisions that Europe, and particularly Germany, had to take. Issues of, I think, paramount importance for the stability of the continent, for peace and freedom in Ukraine. There were three questions. First, would Russia attack Ukraine? Second, would Ukraine be able to defend herself successfully? 3, would Germany be able to break away from its gas dependence on Russia at moderate economic cost and thus be able to act with a free hand in foreign and security policy? In this crisis situation, the answer that politicians, that Berlin found was no, no, and no. The right answer would have been yes, yes, and yes. In other words, we were wrong in what were probably the most important questions that Germany had to answer in the last 30 years since reunification. It took time and gambled away a lot of trust with allies and also a lot of money to then correct these misjudgments bit by bit. The result was a policy that was too hesitant for a very long time, also because it started from false premises, feared the end of gas supplies and the possibility of blackmail. Berlin was visibly impressed by Putin's threats and by the warnings of national interest groups. In the end, it was Putin, not a strategically acting German foreign policy, that brought about the end of gas imports. German foreign policy rather hid behind some industries and their concerns. The third question, the possibility of adapting the economy, was a debate that directly affects my subject, economics. It was the subject of a heated debate between mainly academic economists and the representatives of other groups, interest groups, and their think tanks. In the public discussion, there was talk of mass poverty and popular uprising. The CEO of Germany's largest chemical company asked whether we want to destroy our entire national economy with our eyes open. And the Institute of the German Economy, financed by business associations, considered 2.5 to 3 million additional unemployed quite conceivable. The leadership of the industrial organization saw the country's substance threatened, but the trade unions too were undercutting and producing alarmist studies. In reality, the adjustment worked without major distortions. Germany consumed about 20% less gas last year, and German industry about 22% less gas than last year. In the same period, industrial production in Germany increased by 1%. Households consumed about 15% less, and additional supplies from other countries, not least LNG from the US, filled the gap. At the heart of the successful adjustment was the price mechanism, the backbone of the market economy, its real strength. Many economists underestimated this. The price signal worked through the system, leads to adjustments where they are easiest to achieve. The market produces knowledge that no government has. We have, in Germany, distrusted this mechanism, and as a consequence have made crisis policy under problematic pretenses. This insight that we have no better mechanism than the market to allocate scarce goods is something that I think we need to remember, especially for climate transformation. To this day, the myth persists also that Germany and Europe were simply lucky, i.e., with warm temperatures in winter or other special factors. I do think the opposite is actually true. If one could have chosen a year to cause maximum damage by ending gas supplies to Europe, it was last year. Why is that? Well, first, the French nuclear power plants weren't shut down. They went off grid, and the drought in Europe caused a dramatic drop in electricity generation by hydroelectric power plants. Last year was also not much warmer than usual. The warm days were mainly in October and November when the storage facilities were already full. The average temperature in the winter of 2022-23 was 2.9 degrees compared to 3 degrees in the 4 years before. In essence, it was a winter just in line with the trend of a warming continent. Could we have tolerated an even earlier embargo? Again, the answer is we know today that the answer is probably yes. The calculation is simple. In the end, it wasn't even close. At the end of the heating period, there was still 160 terawatt hours of gas in storage tanks in Germany, and around 100 terawatt hours still came from Russia from March to July. So even without Russian gas, there would have been the storage facilities would have been a quarter full at the end of winter. That's close, I agree, but it would have worked. The bottom line is that we got off okay, but not because we were particularly competent in crisis management. One exception are the LNG terminals, which were built in record time. So some things on the operational level really worked well. But the big picture, that's where we were wrong. Probably the central strategic issues of last year were issues where we started from false premises. Our actions were guided by erroneous assumptions that tied our hands in essential security questions. I do think there's a more fundamental problem here. Germany is not particularly competent in crisis management, neither currently nor historically, and this has potentially serious consequences. This is because the development of crisis competence will be a major challenge and a major asset in the coming decades. We talk about the term resilience quite often, and resilience very prominently includes political crisis competence. We wouldn't have to worry about lacking crisis competence if crises came rarely or weren't costly. But the frequency of crises has already increased substantially in the last 2 decades. And at the heart of my assessment of this issue is that we will not, and I think I'm on the same page here as Corinne, will not return to any kind of form of normality very soon. Of course, the questions that arise in crisis are not always the same. History repeats itself, doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, to paraphrase Mark Twain. But the idea that when hopefully the terrible Russian war of aggression is over, we will return to some kind of normality, I think is naive. The crises are lining up. Of course, we have to be careful not to overdo the crisis narrative and see a new crisis around the corner every time. But as Corinne said, the historian Adam Tooze uses the word polycrisis, the idea of overlapping crises in different areas of our environment, on the military domain and politics, economy, technology, migration. The list of simultaneous challenges is really long. Former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers recently remarked on the climate transformation that this is the most complex, diverse, and multi-layered challenge I can remember in the 40 years I've been paying attention to such things. The recently deceased French philosopher Bruno Latour put it during the corona pandemic in the following words: "This is all just the dress rehearsal for the climate crisis we are facing." Irreversible interventions in the planet's eco-balance will not only lead to further natural disasters, pandemics, and droughts, but also to waves of migration, political conflicts over scarce resources between and within societies. In the age of polycrisis, I argue, and I think, crisis competence becomes extremely important and even a competitive advantage. And if I really would like to scare you, I would ask you to look at the state of Western democracies, that is, at our political government system or political government mechanisms at the beginning of this period, at the outset of the polycrisis. In the US, in Britain, in France, in Israel, in Italy, the party systems have already slipped or populists are on the rise, and now increasingly in Germany as well. Last year, the percentage of countries governed by populists was at an all-time high of 25%. So you might say, if we want to start from somewhere, it's not from here. We're starting from a point where much is already in a big mess. Why do I think that Germany in particular is not well positioned in these matters? I think German deficits in crisis management had already become apparent during the pandemic. The Scientific Advisory Board of the Federal Ministry of Economics diagnosed, quotation citing, structures, processes, and ways of thinking that seem archaic, and did not hesitate to speak of organizational failure in an official report. 60% of Germans considered the state to be overburdened in the fulfillment of its task. The state was disenchanted at the time, as I'd summarized in a little book title, and with consequences. There was dissatisfaction, declining legitimacy, rising protest, and an overall disenchantment with the political system and democracy. It is also illuminating to look at the last major economic crisis, the global economic and financial crisis of 2008, from which then the euro crisis followed. The global financial crisis had begun with a credit-financed real estate market bubble in the US. It bursted and dragged the American financial system into the abyss. Between 2008 and 2012, no fewer than 465 American banks went bankrupt. The US financial system was on its knees, but already a few years later, it looked like the Eurozone was the big loser of that crisis, not the US. The gross domestic product of the Eurozone needed more than half a decade until 2015 to return to its pre-crisis level. In the US, the country where the crisis started, it was already a good 10% above the pre-crisis level at the time. A look at the crisis in recent years is also revealing. At the beginning of the 2010s, the EU and US economies were quite close in size, with a size difference of maybe just 10%. By 2015, this difference had risen to just under 6,000 billion, or 6 trillion, 6,000 billion. Today, ladies and gentlemen, at market prices, the US economy is almost twice the size of the European economy. We've lost a lot of ground to the US economy over the last decade. And if you zoom in, it's particularly that we lose ground during crises because we're hit harder and we're slower to recover. This summarizes my second central point. Lack of crisis competence is extremely expensive. In the words of Martina Navratilova, some of you might remember her, tennis player, best female tennis player in the world for a long time. She said, to get ahead and stay there, it's not about how good you are when you're good, it's about how good you are when you're bad. And Europe is bad when we're bad. Developing crisis competence is a special challenge for Germany. Our specialty is formulating rules to avoid crises, not dealing with crises. Restraint instead of actionism, stable framework conditions instead of direct intervention, rules instead of experiments. These are the foundations of economic policy in Germany. Rule orientation occupies a prominent position in German economic thought, policy making, especially when you look at it from an international perspective. In the German tradition, the state sets and protects the regulatory framework within which competition, innovation, and growth can take place. But it does not otherwise interfere. As a referee, the state neither intervenes in the game of market forces nor changes the rules too often, but relies on constancy. This rule-based thinking has its historical roots, not least in the experience of the 1930s, when the National Socialists, the Nazis, used the state and turned it into an instrument of the dictatorial takeover of the economy and society. But it was also the perception of the Weimar Republic that played an important role in the development of that thinking. The Weimar state was perceived as a tool almost, like as a plaything of economic interests, a crisis-ridden interventionist state overburdened with tasks and ultimately weak, which then contributed to the unfolding crisis. This overloading with tasks, which had contributed to the crisis in the final days of the Weimar Republic, was not to be repeated. While Carl Schmitt welcomed the crisis and the state of emergency and described it as the moment in which it became apparent who was sovereign, the avoidance of the state of emergency was henceforth the central pillar of liberal thinking and economic thinking in Germany. And this is all true and right. But there's also another reading of the crisis of the 1930s, namely a reading that this wasn't just a German crisis. It was the Great Depression. It was a worldwide economic crisis. Many countries faced similar situations. The Great Depression was a global phenomenon. It did not affect just Germany. And there were some countries that coped better with it, countries that got out of the crisis without political collapse. Roosevelt's New Deal in the US, but also our Dutch neighbors or the British managed to get out of the global crisis in better shape. Germany did not. Chancellor Brüning and others deliberately exacerbated the economic crisis, overstretched the system politically and economically, even when the cracks could no longer be overlooked. What was lacking then was the ability and the will to change course, the ability to do differently today what we thought was right yesterday. The Hungary Chancellor stayed the course. The patient was dead in the end. No question, economic policy rules are important. They structure and preserve the normal state of affairs. They help to avoid crises. They are risk managers. Think, for example, of the much debated debt brake in Germany, a rule that is supposed to prevent us from getting into a crisis. But when it comes to crisis management, the conflicting goals between short-term stabilization and long-term order, other perspectives and options for action become important. In normal times, the motto is that no intervention by the state is the best rule. This does not necessarily apply in a moment of crisis. In crises, quick, decisive action and leadership are required. Improvisation and sometimes unconventional solutions become important. It is about making decisions for which there is no rule book, where unexpected things have to be pragmatically assessed with speed and with the ability to be comfortable to get things approximately right instead of thoroughness and exact adherence to rules. Such a state of mind, such a framework of thinking, and such a crisis competence requires self-confidence, flexibility in thinking, the willingness to rethink the tried and tested, and throw rules overboard that stand in your way in the moment of crisis. Crisis management sometimes makes things necessary that are wrong in normal times. Such switching between normal and exceptional states is a necessary prerequisite for being successful. It requires structures and processes with which options for actions can be generated in real time, in which science and politics come together. Tempora mutantur et nos et in illis. You may remember Ovid's beautiful hexameter from Latin class. Times change, and we change with them. The change of times, the Zeitenwende, if you will, the sudden awakening in another world, is the modern version of this old Latin phrase. The era of the Zeitenwende is one where, as we heard in the introduction, the frequency, the severity, and the interaction of crises will challenge us in ways that we haven't seen before. To prepare, we must quickly build the intellectual infrastructure to deal with this polycrisis. Here too, the experience of the last few years is central for me. We've seen that we lack the central structures necessary to manage crises that encompass economic, foreign policy, and security issues at the same time. My main message to you today is that we're not well prepared for what is coming. In crisis situations, state coordination becomes central. Without an efficient and crisis-proof state, government apparatus, we will not master the crises. That means that the development of state capacity is, in my eyes, a central task for the future in which we must invest. Not just, if I can add this, to deal with the urgent, the state of emergency when it's there, but also to guide the transformation, the structural change in our economies that are going to happen, or that we want to happen, in the context of climate transformation and the energy transition. So state capacity is a term that has been central to recent research in economic history, as it describes the ability and the fact that the ability of governments to prepare to set the state that is necessary for private enterprise to flourish. If you look at the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, it is quite clear that those countries and those economies did best, that where state capacity was strong, and the state was in a position to coordinate the multiple tasks and multiple challenges that are involved in coordinating a transformation of the economy. We will need a similar reinvention of state capacity as well. And I wish, and we had fascinating discussions about this already, and I wish that we would, from a liberal perspective, where the state and government have for the past few decades maybe not we're not in the center of attention, that we find back to ways where we think about not building a bigger, a larger, or more efficient, but a stronger, leaner, and more competent, risk-taking state that has the capacity to guide us through crisis and transformation. I think where this is lacking, and when science is left out, it is particular interest in lobbying associations that will fill the intellectual vacuum. It is NGOs, it is all kinds of activists with their arguments that might win the day. But this is certainly not the way to get through the public crisis. More than ever before, I think we will need the ability to deal with these shocks and difficulties. And in this respect, the old German football wisdom of Sepp Herberger applies here in a modified form. After the crisis is before the crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.